It's February 1942. Deep in the Siberian wilderness, temperatures have dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. A woman named Klavdia Nazarova swings her pickaxe into frozen earth that's as hard as concrete. Around her, 300 other women chip away at the same impossible task, laying railway track by hand, racing against time, cold, and an enemy 2,000 kilometers to the west. By the time this story ends, these women will have moved millions of tons of gravel, steel, and timber. They'll reconstruct 8,000 kilometers of railway, more than the distance from London to Baghdad, and yet their names never appeared in history books alongside the night witches or the female snipers of Stalingrad. This is the story of 30,000 women who built the most critical supply line of the Eastern Front with nothing but hand tools, horse carts, and unbreakable will. Without them, the Soviet war machine would have ground to a halt. Without them, there might not have been a victory at all. This is the story of the Invisible Army. To understand why these women found themselves in the frozen Siberian wilderness, we need to go back to the catastrophic summer of 1941. When Operation Barbarossa shattered the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, Hitler's Wehrmacht didn't just conquer territory, they consumed it. By December, German forces had captured or destroyed 30,000 kilometers of Soviet railway. They'd seized the industrial heartland of Ukraine and Belarus. Thousands of factories, millions of workers, entire cities' worth of machinery were either burning or flying Nazi flags. Stalin faced an impossible equation. The Soviet Union was losing the war because they were losing their industrial base. The solution was equally impossible: move that entire industrial base east, beyond the reach of German bombers, and rebuild it from nothing. What followed was the largest industrial evacuation in human history. Between July and November 1941, the Soviets relocated 1,523 factories, entire steel mills, tank plants, aircraft manufacturers, onto 1.5 million railway cars and shipped them east to the Ural Mountains. With them went over 10 million workers and their families. But here's the problem that doesn't appear in most history books. Moving those factories was only half the battle. The Trans-Siberian Railway, that legendary 9,000-kilometer steel thread connecting Moscow to Vladivostok, suddenly became the Soviet Union's most critical artery. Every tank, every bullet, every drop of aviation fuel produced in those relocated Ural factories had to travel 2,000 kilometers west along this railway to reach the front lines. Simultaneously, Lend-Lease supplies from America and Britain were arriving at Pacific ports and needed to travel the opposite direction. Do the mathematics, and the impossible becomes clear. The Soviet logistics system needed to run at 13 trains per hour through 1943 and 1944 to keep the war effort alive. But who would maintain this railway? Who would repair bomb damage, rebuild destroyed sections, and construct new connecting lines when every able-bodied man was either fighting or working in those relocated factories? The answer came in the form of a decree from the State Defense Committee in October 1941, Women's Railway Construction Battalions. The recruitment notices appeared in cities and collective farms across the Urals and Siberia in late 1941. The language was bureaucratic, almost mundane. Women volunteers needed for railway maintenance and construction duties, non-combat assignment, essential war work. What the notices didn't mention was that these non-combat assignments would take place in some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, often in areas vulnerable to partisan activity and German air raids. They came anyway, 30,000 of them. Factory workers, farm girls, teachers, students whose universities had closed, widows whose husbands were already dead at the front, women whose sons and brothers were fighting, who couldn't pull a trigger or fly a plane but could swing a pickaxe and carry steel rails. 23-year-old Klavdia Nazarova, the woman we met at the beginning, had been studying civil engineering in Leningrad when the war erupted. After evacuating east, she volunteered immediately. "I could calculate load-bearing capacity and stress points," she wrote in her diary. "I thought they'd make me a supervisor. Instead, they handed me a shovel." The women were organized into battalions of 300 to 500 workers each, mirroring military structure. Each battalion received a section of railway to maintain, typically 50 to 100 kilometers of track. Their orders were simple and brutal: keep the trains running, no matter what. The reality of railway construction in 1942 was medieval by modern standards. Every piece of mechanized equipment, every excavator, Every crane, every truck had been diverted to military construction projects, building tank traps, fortifications, emergency airfields. The women's battalions would rebuild the Trans-Siberian Railway, the same way the pharaohs built the pyramids. Human muscle, hand tools, animal labor. Let me give you the mathematics of what this meant in practice. A single kilometer of railway requires 2,400 wooden sleepers, the ties that hold the rails in place. Each sleeper weighs about 80 kilograms. That's 192 tons of timber per kilometer, all cut, shaped, treated, transported, and positioned by hand. Then comes the ballast, the gravel bed the tracks sit on. Each kilometer requires 120 tons of crushed stone, shoveled and wheelbarrowed into place, then tamped down to create a stable foundation. Finally, the rails themselves. 60 tons of steel per kilometer, carried in 12-meter sections that required 6 women to lift and position. Now multiply that by 8,000 kilometers. The total distance these women's battalions would reconstruct during the war, but the numbers don't capture the reality. The numbers don't tell you what it felt like. Battalion 217, stationed near Novosibirsk, kept detailed records. Their daily logs read like dispatches from another planet. January 18th, 1942. Temperature minus 38 degrees. Steel rails freeze to bare hands on contact. 5 women treated for frostbite. Work continues. February 3rd, 1942. Blizzard conditions. Visibility less than 10 meters. Crew works in groups of 6, tied together with rope to prevent members getting lost. 2 kilometers of track cleared. March 12th, 1942. First locomotive passed through reconstructed section at 060 hours. Crew cheered despite exhaustion. No breaks. Next section begins immediately. The women worked in shifts that could last 16 hours when urgent repairs were needed. They slept in converted railway cars or hastily built barracks that offered minimal protection from the cold. Their rations were theoretically equivalent to combat soldiers, 800 grams of bread per day, meat twice weekly, but supply convoys were often delayed or diverted, leaving battalions to subsist on whatever they could find. And remember, these were designated non-combat units, which meant they worked without armed guards in sectors considered safe. 26-year-old Maria Volkova led a crew of 40 women maintaining track near Omsk. In her letters home, she described the constant anxiety. The partisan situation makes every work shift a gamble. We're not officially in a combat zone, so we don't get military protection, but we're close enough that we hear explosions. Close enough that reconnaissance aircraft sometimes fly overhead. Close enough that we work with rifles stacked nearby, just in case. The designation non-combat proved tragically ironic. While these women weren't storming German positions, they faced dangers that kill just as efficiently. Exposure, exhaustion, workplace accidents with heavy machinery and material. Soviet logistics records, declassified decades later, reveal a sobering statistic. Female railway battalions suffered casualty rates 40% higher than equivalent male units, primarily from exposure-related injuries and workplace accidents. Why? Because female battalions were assigned the sections with the least priority for equipment and supplies. Male battalions got first pick of available tools, warmer clothing, and better rations. The women made do with whatever was left. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the women developed a reputation for stubborn, furious efficiency. The moment that would define these women's contribution came in the spring of 1942, when Stalin's planners realized they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Lend-Lease supplies from America and Britain, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, were piling up at Pacific ports faster than they could be transported west. The Trans-Siberian Railway was operating at capacity, but it wasn't enough. Soviet forces at the front were consuming supplies faster than existing railways could deliver them. The State Defense Committee issued an emergency directive: construct 14 new connecting railway lines to increase capacity and create redundancy in case of German bombing. Total distance, over 3,000 kilometers. Timeline, 12 months. This wasn't maintenance. This wasn't repair work. This was building railways through virgin Siberian wilderness in the middle of a war, with hand tools, in sub-zero temperatures. The bulk of this impossible task fell to the women's battalions. Battalion 1901, commanded by Valentina Gromova, received orders in April 1942 to construct a 220-kilometer connecting line through swampy forest north of Krasnoyarsk. Gromova looked at the maps, looked at her 380 exhausted women, looked at the pile of shovels and pickaxes that constituted their equipment, and asked the commissar when the bulldozers would arrive. The commissar's response was simple. There are no bulldozers. The party believes in you. What followed was a construction sprint that defied human endurance limits. The women worked 18-hour shifts, sleeping in rotating crews so work never stopped. They felled trees by hand to clear the right-of-way. They dug drainage ditches through permafrost. They hauled timber and steel through knee-deep mud when the spring thaw turned the forest floor into a swamp. Klavdia Nazarova, now serving with Battalion 181, wrote in May 1942, "We've stopped thinking of ourselves as women. We've stopped thinking of ourselves as human. We're machines made of meat and bone, and our only function is to move earth and lay steel. Some nights I fall asleep still swinging my pickaxe in my dreams." The casualty rate spiked. Pneumonia swept through the battalions. Women collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried to medical tents. Accidents increased as fatigue made workers clumsy. A misplaced foot, a dropped rail, a moment of inattention could mean crushed limbs or worse. And still the work continued. By August 1942, Battalion 181 had completed 140 kilometers of their assigned route. They were behind schedule, undersupplied and operating at 60% strength due to injuries and illness. Then the order came through. The Wehrmacht had launched a new offensive towards Stalingrad. Every available locomotive and rail car was being diverted to move reserves south. The women's battalions would receive no supply deliveries for the next 6 weeks. Gromova gathered her battalion and presented them with a choice. They could suspend construction until supplies resumed. Meeting the official deadline was now impossible anyway. Or they could push forward with what they had and finish as much as possible. The vote was unanimous. They would continue. The next 6 weeks tested everything these women had. Cut off from regular supply convoys, they improvised with a creativity born of desperation. When timber supplies ran out, they salvaged sleepers from less critical spur lines. When steel rails didn't arrive, they sent scrounging teams to abandoned construction sites to recover whatever they could find. When food rations dwindled, they foraged in the forests, berries, mushrooms, whatever was edible. Battalion 217, working on a parallel route 300 kilometers south, faced a different crisis. German reconnaissance aircraft had begun systematic bombing runs against the Trans-Siberian Railway, targeting bridges and junction points. The women had watched distant explosions light up the night sky. They'd heard the stories of repair crews caught in bombing raids in September 1942. The war arrived on their doorstep. Maria Volkova, now a crew leader in Battalion 217, was supervising track placement when she heard the sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life, the high-pitched whistle of a diving Junkers Ju-88 bomber. "We had maybe 15 seconds warning," she later testified. "I screamed for everyone to scatter into the tree line. Most mate. Tatyana Sokolova was too far from cover. She threw herself into a drainage ditch we'd just dug. The bombs hit 200 meters away, targeting the junction we'd spent 6 weeks rebuilding. 3 women died in that raid. 12 more were wounded by the bombing had destroyed 2 weeks of work. Twisted rails, cratered earth, a small bridge reduced to splinters. By every logical measure, Battalion 217 should have pulled back to regroup. They'd just suffered casualties. They were traumatized. They were exhausted. Instead, they began rebuilding that same night. Volkova wrote, "We worked in the dark because light would attract more bombers. We worked in silence because speaking required energy we didn't have. We worked because stopping felt like dying. We worked because those 3 women hadn't died for nothing. We worked because the trains had to run." Across the Trans-Siberian network, similar scenes played out in dozens of women's battalions. Partisan raids, equipment failures, disease outbreaks. Every conceivable obstacle appeared, and every time these invisible soldiers found a way forward. The Soviet logistics apparatus tracked their output obsessively. Ministry reports from late 1942 show something remarkable. Female railway battalions were achieving 92% of the construction output of equivalent male units, despite working with inferior equipment and facing higher casualty rates. But numbers only tell part of the story. In October 1942, Klavdia Nazarova's Battalion 181 completed their 220-kilometer connecting line, 2 months behind the original deadline, but finished nonetheless. The commissar who told them the party believes in you returned for the inauguration ceremony. He found 280 women, 100 fewer than had started, standing beside a railway that looked like it had been carved from the wilderness by giants. Every meter of track perfect, every joint sound, every sleeper properly seated. "How did you do it?" he asked Gromova. Her response became legendary among railway workers. "The same way Russia does everything. We suffered. We endured. We won." By the end of 1942, the new connecting lines were operational. Lend-lease supplies that had been bottlenecked at Pacific ports were finally flowing west. The tempo of railway traffic increased from 9 trains per hour to 13. Exactly the rate Soviet logistics planners had calculated was necessary to sustain the war effort. Soviet tank production in the Urals hit 24,000 units in 1942. Every single one traveled west on railways maintained or constructed by these women. Soviet aircraft factories delivered 25,000 planes. Everyone flew using fuel and parts transported along these steel arteries. The Red Army at Stalingrad held, then counterattacked, supplied by an unbreakable logistics chain stretching back 2,000 kilometers to the Ural factories, and none of it would have been possible without 30,000 women whose names appeared in dusty logistics reports but never in newspapers. The final test came in the winter of 1943. By then, the tide of war had shifted. Stalingrad had fallen to the Soviets. The Wehrmacht was in retreat across a 1,000-kilometer front, but victory brought its own logistics nightmare. Soviet forces were advancing faster than supply lines could keep up. The State Defense Committee issued another emergency directive: repair and reconstruct railways in newly liberated territories at unprecedented speed. The Red Army was outrunning its supplies, and unless logistics could catch up, the advance would stall. Once again, the women's battalions were mobilized. But this time, they were heading west, into recently liberated areas where the Germans had systematically destroyed everything before retreating. Klavdia Nazarova's battalion was assigned to reconstruct 180 kilometers of railway in Ukraine that the Wehrmacht had demolished so thoroughly it would have been faster to build from scratch. Every bridge blown, every switch yard destroyed, mines scattered across the right-of-way. This was different from Siberian construction. This was working in an active war zone. "We heard artillery every day," Nazarova wrote in February 1943. "Sometimes it was distant thunder. Sometimes it was close enough to feel the concussion in our chests. We worked wearing helmets now, carrying gas masks. The Germans were gone, but their demolitions and booby traps remained. Mine-clearing teams worked ahead of construction crews, but the process was imperfect. 3 women from Battalion 181 died when a buried mine detonated under a cart carrying rails. The psychological toll was immense. After 18 months of brutal labor in Siberia, these women were now working in landscapes scarred by war. They passed through villages reduced to ash. They saw evidence of atrocities. They found the bodies of civilians and soldiers that no one had time to bury. And they kept building. Maria Volkova's crew reached the outskirts of Kursk in March 1943. Tasked with rebuilding the junction that had been the focus of savage fighting. "The city was a wasteland," she wrote. "But in the distance we could see Soviet supply trains waiting for us to finish. We could see tank transporters loaded with T-34s that couldn't reach the front until we laid the last rail." In April 1943, Battalion 217 completed their section. Within 6 hours, the first locomotive passed through carrying ammunition and fuel. Within 24 hours, a full supply convoy was rolling west. The same scene repeated across dozens of battalions. Women's crews finishing their sections, stepping back and watching the trains thunder past, trains carrying the supplies that would make victory possible. By summer 1943, the railways in liberated territories were operational again. The Soviet advance continued, and the women who'd made it possible returned to their bases, exhausted and forgotten. The war ended in May 1945. The women's railway construction battalions were officially demobilized that summer. 30,000 women had served in these units over 4 years. They'd reconstructed 8,000 kilometers of railway. They'd built 14 new connecting lines, totaling over 3,000 kilometers. They'd kept the Trans-Siberian Railway, the Soviet Union's primary artery, functioning through the darkest period of the war. Their casualty rate was staggering. Soviet records indicate that approximately 4,200 women died in railway construction battalions, a 14% fatality rate. Deaths from exposure, workplace accidents, disease, and enemy action. Most have no marked graves. They died far from home, were buried beside the railways they built, and disappeared from history. After years of brutal physical labor, they returned to a society that viewed their contribution as less significant than combat service. Female pilots, snipers, and tank commanders received medals and recognition. The women who built the railways received demobilization papers and vague promises of employment. Klavdia Nazarova returned to Leningrad and tried to resume her engineering studies. "No one wanted to hear about what we'd done," she wrote. "When I mentioned the railway work, people assumed I'd been cooking meals or doing clerical work. The idea that women had laid steel and moved mountains of earth seemed absurd to them." Maria Volkova applied for positions with Soviet railways, citing her 4 years of experience. She was offered a job as a secretary. "They needed engineers," she recalled bitterly. "But they wanted male engineers. Our experience didn't count." The official Soviet histories of World War II, published in the decades that followed, devoted thousands of pages to military campaigns, industrial production, and heroic sacrifices. The women's railway construction battalions received a single footnote in the chapter on logistics. Railway maintenance was carried out by volunteer labor units, including women's battalions. 21 words to describe 30,000 lives, 8,000 kilometers, and 4 years of impossible labor. For decades, this remained a forgotten chapter of the war. Then, in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, previously classified logistics records became available to historians. What they revealed was stunning. Soviet railway operations during 1943-1944 transported 19.4 million tons of supplies. The tempo of 13 trains per hour through the Trans-Siberian network, impossible by pre-war standards, was real. And it was only possible because of the maintenance and construction work done by these women's battalions. Military historians now recognize that Soviet victory in the Eastern Front depended on 3 factors: industrial relocation to the Urals, Lend-Lease supplies from the Allies, and the logistics network connecting them. The women's railway battalions were the third, invisible pillar. In 2003, a small memorial was erected near Novosibirsk honoring the women's railway battalions. It features a bronze sculpture of a woman holding a pickaxe, standing beside a section of rail. The inscription reads simply, "They kept the trains running." Klavdia Nazarova lived to see that memorial. She was 84 years old, one of the last surviving battalion members. At the dedication ceremony, a journalist asked her if she felt bitter about being forgotten for so long. Her response, "We didn't do it for recognition. We did it because it had to be done. We did it because men were dying at the front and we could swing pickaxes and carry steel. We did it because Russia was burning and we had hands to rebuild it." She died in 2005. Her obituary in the local newspaper described her as a retired engineer and war veteran. It made no mention of the 8,000 kilometers. Today, the Trans-Siberian Railway still runs. Trains still carry goods between the Pacific ports and Moscow. Modern locomotives pass over sections of track that haven't been replaced since 1943, sections laid by women whose names are lost. What many don't know is that in 2019, Russian railways launched an initiative to identify and document every woman who served in the construction battalions. Using archival records, they've confirmed approximately 23,000 names so far. The project continues, and in 2023, exactly 80 years after the peak of these battalions' operations, a documentary filmmaker traveled the length of the Trans-Siberian Railway, stopping at the sites where women's battalions had worked. She found elderly residents in remote villages who still remembered the women who built the railway. Some had photographs, some had letters, some had stories passed down through generations. The invisible army is slowly becoming visible again. War is often remembered through its battles. The dramatic clashes, the heroic charges, the turning points where everything hung in the balance, and those moments were real. They mattered profoundly. But battles are won by logistics, by supply lines, by railways that keep running no matter what, by people who do impossibly hard work in anonymity, knowing their contribution won't be celebrated. 30,000 women built and maintained the supply line that kept the Soviet Union alive during its darkest hour. They worked in conditions that would have broken professional construction crews. They achieved output that logistics experts considered impossible. They died at rates higher than many combat units. And they did it all while the world looked elsewhere. The next time you hear about the Eastern Front, about Stalingrad or Kursk, or the drive to Berlin, remember the Invisible Army. Remember the women standing in minus 40-degree cold, swinging pickaxes into frozen earth, laying rails by hand, knowing that every meter they built brought victory one step closer. Remember Plavdiya Nazarova and Maria Volkova, and the 4,200 women who never came home. Remember that history is built as much by the unnamed as the famous, as much by those who swing pickaxes as those who fire guns. Remember that 30,000 women kept the trains running, and that made all the difference.